The information expressed in the following podcast is intended for educational purposes only and was created by and belongs solely to Believe Limited and the Flow podcast and does not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Please speak to your healthcare provider before making any medical decisions.
This is July 2022, and the Flow team would like to start this episode with an acknowledgement that abortion is healthcare. Hi, I'm Jessica, and welcome to Flow. I'm here with Sarah Watson, sex therapist. We're going to keep asking, how's your flow? Welcome once again to Flow, coming to you today from Los Angeles, Detroit, Portland, and Paris. With the Flow tradition, we hope you'll join Bethany and Maribek, aka Dr. Period Hackers. To start off, we have this tradition. We normalize period talk with a How's Your Flow check-in. It's good to know where we all are, menstrually speaking, as we enter conversation. Sarah, did you mind kicking us off? How's your flow?
Love to kick us off. I am in the luteal phase, so just went through ovulation and glad that's through because mine tends to last a little bit longer than I'd like, but through it. Mary Beck, how about you?
Also in the luteal phase. I'm about maybe 6 days out from my normal scheduled period. Quick in and out, 3 days of bleeding, and then that's that. Pretty regular, pretty excited about that.
Nice.
How about you?
I'm actually 8 weeks pregnant, so I'm not having any flow at all right now.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. But you know what? Knowing your flow is super helpful in the process of trying to get pregnant. Definitely did a lot of cycle tracking to have this successful pregnancy. So big fan of knowing your flow.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm very pleased to check in and say that I will probably start menstruating during this recording. I'm pretty sure. Just about there. We're going to come back to talk more about Dr. Period Hackers right after this quick break.
This ad is brought to you by Von Vendi, Von Willebrand Factor Recombinant.
My name is Nicole, and my deciding factor is making my voice heard. To hear the backstory, drop by Von Vendi, that's vonvendi.com/patient-stories.
We are back with Dr. Period Hackers. They're taking on Twitter, and this is a new existence. We were just before we started recording talking about how you two met. Bethany, Maribek, could we start there? How do you two know each other?
We met about a year ago through not even a mutual friend, somebody who's a friend of Mary Beck from high school who read some stuff on Twitter and connected us.
Yeah, my very good friend from high school in Huntsville, Alabama, Stephen Anfield, doing the magic of the internet on the Twitters. And who would have thought a Twitter random connection would have led to something like this? But here we are.
Right. And you've never met in person, but you've been collaborating for over a year now?
Yeah.
Just about a year, yeah.
Just about
Our
a year.
first tweet was in August of 2021, so we're approaching the year mark.
Yeah, and I think we sat down in July and we're we can get this thing started in 2 weeks, no big deal. And innocence and naivete, but here we are.
Innocence and naivete. Well, I can't wait to hear more about that. But wait, so thanks Stephen for connecting you two, because great, powerful minds having passionate period advocacy in their hearts are good to be working together. Can I also ask, because we do benefit the rare bleeding disorders community, how are you both connected to NHF, the National Hemophilia Foundation?
Oh, this is all Bethany.
Oh, great.
So I'm actually a hematologist. I work in a hemophilia treatment center, which treats all kinds of bleeding disorders. And so I have been sort of peripherally connected to NHF for a long time through that. But we actually got more closely connected recently. I think it was about 6 months ago when they reached out to us based on some of our tweets about periods and bleeding disorders and such, and have had a nice little collaboration. We had a Twitter chat, which was a new learning experience for Mary Beck and I, and it's been really wonderful. NHF is fantastic. They do great work, and we're really privileged to work with them.
Lovely. Bethany, could you tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to go into hematology and how that worked out for you?
Yeah, it's a story. I'll try to keep it short. Basically, my intern year, which is the year after you finish medical school, when you're working 80 hours a week, sometimes 30-hour shifts, I was on birth control to make life more tolerable, as many of us are. And I wound up having a blood clot related to it. It was in my leg, and I ignored it until it went to my lung, which is a really bad idea. Don't do that. And they actually connected me with this wonderful woman. Her name was Dr. Minicello, who was a blood clotting expert down where I did my residency in San Francisco. And I think it was mostly because they thought maybe she would keep me out of trouble because I had shown some poor judgment. But she was positively inspirational. And working with her on thrombosis and then later bleeding disorders and stuff like that, things just kind of took off from there. So it was a little bit unexpected, but I love it.
Oh, that's great. I love that story. There's always somebody that always in hemophilia community, like it's always a connection or a moment and something like that. So I love to hear that. Mary Beck, tell us about your work as a LGBTQ researcher and sexuality. Like what's a little bit more about your background and how did you get started?
Yeah. So I have my PhD in public health and I focus on like queer health, broadly speaking, and sexual reproductive health. So it's kind of just sort of is a natural evolution. And I'm a product of the 80s. So like here is my hemophilia connection. So I watched the HIV AIDS epidemic like unfold on TV like so many other people. And just like kind of very deeply inspired by Ryan White's story and things like that as like a way for a young person to connect to a young person and try to make sense of this thing that you were seeing like on the TV. And then ever since then, it's just, whatever queer and or feminist soapbox I can get on to help people get the services they need and like non-judgmental, affirming spaces. That is what I am here for. I like recently have also branched out into like a little bit of sexology, and I just finished training as a doula as well. So yeah. So like if it is about anything sexual health related, I am here for it.
I love that. I love it. I also completely understand it, right? As being a sex therapist and like wanting to know all about sexual health. It's enticing to keep digging and keep learning for sure.
Yeah, I can't turn down educational debt. I'm like, what's the next thing I can learn? What's the next degree I can get?
Perfect.
Great. Well, I want to hear more as feminist soapboxes, to be quite honest. I always have ears for that. But let's talk about Dr. Period Hackers, this collaboration. Here's the thing. Dr. Period Hackers is the name of your work online. Your hacks are educational and all accessible on Twitter. And that's at DrPeriodHackers, Dr. Period Hackers. Why Twitter? What brought you to Twitter as your outlet?
I can take that one. Actually, in a weird way for me, it was kind of a product of the pandemic. When normally, in the medical community, we have annual meetings for like 5 different societies, which means you're going to this big meeting, pretty much every other month throughout the year. And all that shut down during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And a lot of folks in medicine have turned really to Twitter to get some of that networking, some of that, and it's kind of turned into an educational thing as well. And so for me, it was a really good platform to get just really bite-sized, accessible snippets of information out there. It doesn't require the commitment to like sit down and do a YouTube video. And let's be honest, I would be terrible at that. It's just a nice way to reach a lot of people, I think. So that was kind of my motivation with Twitter.
The med Twitter community is so active. It's wild. I only kind of tangentially touch it and being in public health, but it's super active and really fascinating.
Great. What did you call that? Sorry, the med
Twitter.
Med Twitter. Cool.
Yeah.
Kind of like different pieces of like sexual health Twitter and like different, They've used also, the young ones use TikTok, right? Like if you're on that side of TikTok, right? You're on the med side of Twitter. So.
Copy.
Yeah. I don't know. I think also Twitter just feels kind of natural since that's like how our introduction happened. And it's just, it's easier to write than to create visuals. But maybe one day we talk about like expanding out into some of the other platforms like Instagram. I don't know about TikTok because then we'd have to be on camera. But maybe one day.
What? You guys need like someone holding the camera and telling you you're great. Because you're great. We can look at each other.
Yes.
Sorry, listeners. We get to see them. They're great. You guys are great on camera. Can we talk more about the term period hacking? What does
Yeah.
period hacking mean to you, and why did you become Dr. Period Hackers?
I think the idea behind that was just this idea that like you can have the menstrual experience that you want. Like if you want to menstruate, that's great. If you want to skip a cycle or two, that's great. The strategies for like, managing flow, different collection methods, things like that, ways to maybe help your period pass a little bit faster. So it's just like, a way to kind of design your period experience and realizing, and Bethany does a lot more work around this, like understanding what abnormal or heavy bleeding is, because so many people just don't know what that is.
Yeah. Bethany, can you give us a 1-2 of that great
Yes,
information?
please.
What do we need to know? What's the basic normal and abnormal of bleeding?
Yeah, absolutely. So like normal length is anywhere from 2 to 7 days. Average cycle is 28 days, but it can be 21 to 35 days. So anything more frequent than that, less frequent than that, lasting longer than that is all abnormal. The thing that I wind up focusing a lot as somebody who takes care of patients with bleeding disorders is heavy bleeding. And we know, first of all, it is possible to measure menstrual flow using complicated chemistry and menstrual products, but let's be honest, that's not practical in everyday life. So symptoms that I look out for, so if somebody's having to change a pad or tampon, particularly if it's like a super or a heavy, more often than every couple hours, that's a red flag for me. Passing clots larger than a quarter. Some clots are normal. Larger than a quarter is worrisome. And having a history of iron deficiency. All of those are signs of heavy bleeding. Unfortunately, we don't know as much with non-pad and tampon collection devices, although menstrual cups are actually awesome because they actually have those little markers on the side sometimes. So anything more than 80 milliliters in a cycle is considered heavy. So if you're filling up that 30 milliliter period cup 3 times per cycle, that's heavy as well.
Great. Can you, so as a woman with a bleeding disorder who has a history of taking tranexamic acid, and y'all have tweeted about that recently, can you tell us more? Can you tell our listeners what that is and how to use it, and how does that help with flow? What does that look like?
Totally. It's my favorite drug. Basically,
mine too.
It's so great. It's good for a lot of things, but specifically period. So the way I think of it is our body is always breaking down clot. It's always making clot. We have to make clot so we don't bleed for the rest of our lives when we cut ourselves shaving or when we have our periods. And we also have to break down clot so we don't wind up with big, dangerous clots when we have an injury. And so basically what the tranexamic acid does is it slows down the process of clot breakdown. So you get to hang on to what clot you form. And it turns out that process of clot breakdown is super active in the uterus around menstruation. And so this medication is really helpful for reducing flow up to 40% in some cases. It's not hormonal. So folks who've had bad experiences with hormonal medications or just don't want to do it, it's not hormonal. And basically the biggest downside of it, I think, is it's 2 pills 3 times a day. So it's a significant burden, but it only has to be taken on the days of bleeding. And some folks even only take it on their heaviest days of bleeding if they have lighter days and they don't want to continue it. It's generally really well tolerated. Some folks will have headaches. Some folks will have nausea. There's a lot of misinformation out there about the risk of causing blood clots, and it doesn't. We have these wonderful, huge studies of folks who've had traumatic injury, who've had orthopedic surgery, who've just had babies, and the ones who got tranexamic acid versus not, no increased risk of blood clotting. And those are all high risk scenarios. So it doesn't cause blood clots. So don't worry about that. Can be expensive. So that's a downside. Not all insurances cover it, particularly for patients with bleeding disorders. Sometimes insurances will only cover 5 days of it per month. And if you have 7 days or 10 days of flow, that could be a problem. So I refer a lot of patients to the GoodRx app, not sponsored by them, but a lot of folks, you can kind of hunt for a pharmacy near you with the lowest price, and you can wind up getting it. A lot of our patients will wind up getting it for $30 a month, which is not nothing, not cheap, but still better than what they would be paying out of pocket without it. So I think it's great.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that 40% statistic like that. That's amazing. Like that's a huge deal in our community. And even for those who aren't diagnosed, that's a big deal. That's a lot of time.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, and it's like the overall blood loss. So it doesn't necessarily cut the length of the cycle.
Sure.
For some patients, it does. And 40% is kind of the optimistic end. Maybe it's more like 20% for some folks. But still, it's significant. It's a meaningful difference.
Right.
And it's definitely helped my patients get out of iron deficiency and all kinds of things.
Right, because that can tank so quickly if you're bleeding, if you have such heavy periods. And then something else you have to deal with on top of this terrible cycle that you're dealing with every month.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so thank you so much for that information. These are the great tips listeners can also learn if you follow at Dr. Period Hackers on Twitter. Some of the other great things you're tweeting about include talking about, I might not be saying the Sanskrit word right, or two, the etymology of regulation as a source word for menstruation in different spoken languages. You tweet about this, you make it understandable and accessible. Are you both sociological and rhetoric buffs? Like what passion of period brought you to these deep levels of understanding about menstruation?
So definitely not. But I think, one of the kind of qualities that people who do med school or do like doctoral studies is like, we're just infinitely curious. And like, this is like a quick Google, and there's a lot of really interesting literature about menstruation and the words. Since I'm the one that's coming to you from Paris, I am also like a lifelong student of French. So it's just like an interesting kind of thing. Like I'm like actively involved in learning the language. I was like, well, my work is around this. I should learn like the slang for menstruation. I was like, oh, interesting. It's all like time-based, like frequency or period, like period meaning time, the duration of time. Like, part of the thing that we talk about on Dr. Period Hackers is this idea of like normalizing talking about your flow and your cycle and just like the rich and diverse slang that exists out there. And it's like, well, if we're going to understand where the slang comes from, we need to understand kind of where the origins of these words come from. And so it's just like, it's really fascinating. Like so many of them obviously have to do with like the color red or visitors coming, this idea of like a foreign body that is here, that is now like taking over your life, which maybe is problematic and doesn't do much for menstrual taboos. And this idea that it happens on a cycle. So it happens, every so often. Like a lot of that's then tied to experiences of menstruating in like the ancient world and how menstruation came to be understood by like the founders of medicine. And like that menstruation was like either a way to like, it happened because femme bodies or bodies with uteruses held on to more blood and then it needed to let it, or that it was a way to let out like bad things that the female or femme body had collected. So it's the idea of like, it's something that happens because the body with a uterus is like not as perfect as a body without a uterus. Like just kind of like really like interesting, and all of this like interwoven. And then we get into the patriarchy and this idea of like medicine versus nature and like this natural cycle of like what it is to have a menstrual cycle. And that just kind of from the beginning, they've all been misunderstood, and like how that gets baked into and encoded into the words we use.
Mm-hmm.
The fear-based understanding of menstruation, when, interestingly enough, the history is that it was the first calendar. We're talking about regulation and time and cycles. Like, it was the origin of the concept of marking time was to track the cycle. So that's a very valuable thing upon which to build society. Why did everyone get so scared? Because it's blood?
I guess. Well, I don't know. And like the men's of the ancient like Greek and Roman worlds didn't menstruate, so they assumed that it was a deficiency in bodies that weren't like theirs. And like there's all these like really, really great myths like around Pliny the Elder. He was like, if a woman who is menstruating comes into contact with fields, they will become barren and nothing can grow there. Milk will curdle, animals will die. And it's just like you really think this? Like at any given moment, I don't know how many percent, like what the percentage is of the population that's menstruating, but like that clearly isn't the case. We would see like mass death events from like, like fields and livestock. And this was written in like an ancient medical tome and was accepted as the medical knowledge for the longest time. So it's not really hard to see that from that origin that we're still dealing with a lot of these myths around like a menstrual cycle and what it does to your emotional state and your mental state, and that like you're angry and
from the ancient myths to the modern pop culture, right? Oh, what, Sarah? Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
I just say it's interesting, right? Men created myths about menstruation, right? They like you don't experience menstruation and you're going to decide how it's going to be. Like nothing makes me rage more. Right? Like, of course, I don't understand it. So it's going to cause crops to die?
I think it's cute that they get so scared. They got so scared. That's so cute.
Shocking.
They're scared of it.
There was something I was reading recently that there's like 80% of high school students in the US say they know more about the anatomy of frogs than they do about the female reproductive tract. Because I don't know about all of you, but I definitely dissected a frog in high school. And it's like, oh, look, my frog is pregnant. So I got to learn about that.
Yep.
Whereas the amount of information that I've learned through doula training and sexology training about my own body as someone who is deeply entrenched in this work, I was just like, how did I not know that cervical fluid was so magical? It's like, oh, right, because nobody talks to us about this.
Yes.
It's absolutely wild to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Same thing here. I say this pretty often when we chat, right? That's part of my job too, is we're educating clients that sit on my couch essentially about all of this information they didn't get or they got on the back of the bus, which doesn't help because it's created from these myths that we've been living with for centuries upon centuries. So it's terrible.
It is. And I mentioned from mythology to pop culture. I'm going to read one of your tweets, which was discussing the film Carrie, which we discussed on last episode, periods in pop culture. Here is the tweet from @DrPeriodHackers. David Linton and, oh goodness, Sanya Lee wrote in The Enduring Menstrual Mystique of Carrie that, quote, the mysterious nature of menstruation that compels both awe and fear, particularly in men and others who have internalized the prevailing menstrual phobias. Oof. The internalized phobias. Is there any period hack of how to deal with internalized phobias?
Yeah.
I mean, first off, shout out to our intern, Barbie Kim. She is an MFA student at NYU, and she does all of our menstrual art, pop culture tweets and things like that. So just giving credit where credit is due.
Round of applause.
And I think the way we hack it is we just start talking about it. And one of the first meetings that Bethany and I had, I was like, listen, so I'm going to go real radical on you for a second. I was like, I believe that we should anyone who menstruates should pick a month out of the year and we should all just free bleed and let society deal with that. And then I guarantee you within a month, they will be like, oh, wait a minute, we need to provide menstrual products for free. And we'll understand what is happening to bodies that menstruate. Nobody's forced to deal with it. It's all internalized and all of that stress and anxiety, which I think then create internally. And this idea that it's shameful or the worst thing that can happen to you is that your collection method, your pad, your tampon, your cup was going to leak. It just means that we don't talk about it. It's this shame-filled thing. And I don't know, let's all free bleed for a month.
Yeah, which
See
month?
how that changes the conversation.
Which month are we doing this?
Whatever one we want.
Okay.
We can pick.
We should probably coordinate. We should probably
months.
all decide on the same month though.
Everyone needs to coordinate on the same month to make it really impactful.
Okay.
I like it.
So yeah, let's pick a one with 31 days. Make everyone deal with it.
Okay, cool.
I'm glad we're all on the same page.
Yeah, it's really just choosing which month now. So maybe we'll put out a poll to our listeners, put out a poll on Twitter. Let's decide what month of the year, maybe in 2023, we rally for it. I don't know.
Excellent.
I'm in. Love it.
I agree that talking about it, I can't think of any answer better than talking about it, to be honest. I think that our society has determined that the male body is the default body and that anything that happens outside of the male body experience is abnormal. And I say this because pop quiz. Does anybody know what year the National Institutes of Health first started requiring that women be included in research studies?
I'm going to say probably the 60s or 70s. I think it's real recent.
1993. in our lifetime.
My soul just died.
1993.
You come back.
Yeah. Which isn't to say that women weren't included in research before that, but that's when they started saying, no, you can't actually just do research of only male bodies and decide that this data applies to the population at large. And I'm not denying that it's more complicated to do research on people who could be pregnant and have menstrual cycles and stuff like that, but we're half the population. It's 100% normal. Who cares if it's more complicated? And we also know that we've had some bad data from those prior studies, right? For years and years and years, women had heart attacks that were totally unrecognized because people didn't realize that it presents often differently in women than men. And so just this idea that anything that doesn't happen to a male body is abnormal and potentially shameful. It's got to go. It's got to go.
Well, and if I can, just building off of that, I do a lot of work around like the history and development of birth control and a lot of the racism that exists in that kind of sphere. And one of the things that happens with the FDA in approving medications for contraception and things like that is that it doesn't have to be perfectly safe with no side effects. It just has to be slightly safer than the risks associated with giving birth, which is one of the reasons why we don't see male birth control, because it has to be held to a higher standard, because since assigned male birth bodies cannot get pregnant, they don't have those risks. So the barriers for getting FDA approval for male birth control is just that much higher, because it has to be absolutely safe. And it's just something that people who have uteruses have never really kind of demanded, this more perfect birth control. And it's sort of the same formulations that we've seen since the 60s with, tweaks and things like that. But we never demand no side effects, because it just has to be safer than the risks associated with giving birth. So like all of this is encoded in the very beginning of all of it.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot to digest. It's a lot to digest.
Deep breathing into the void.
Yes. I'm doing a lot of deep breathing in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Wow.
So we have a long way to go.
Sorry, Jess, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm trying, because it's always a balance. It's a long way to go in the medical community. It's all very recent for us to have voices speaking on behalf of menstruators within that work. I was just going to bring us back to pop culture and the fascination of how media is at least leading the way a little bit. The 2018 film Bollywood the 2018 Bollywood film Padman is something we did not discuss last episode that I wanted to hear what it's about and how is it as a piece of entertainment, in your opinion, Dr. Period Hackers.
I don't know if that tweet was all from our wonderful MFA intern, Barbie Kim.
Yeah.
So I will confess that I have not had a chance to watch it yet. I don't know if you have, Mary Beck.
No, same. I have not either. But I think it's based on the documentary Period End of Sentence about the man who is bringing low-cost menstrual products to rural communities in India. So I think it's really great that it's telling the story of a man who is speaking out on behalf of this community, because I think one of the major issues is that men just don't understand menstruation because they don't have to. And it's really easy just to be like, oh, that's something that the women in my life have to deal with. Mm-hmm. And then it's this idea, too, that it's helping with period poverty and things like that, and bringing low-cost, effective collection methods to communities that cannot get pre-made tampons, pre-made pads, and things like that. So it's also creating jobs for women in the local community. And so it's like a really interesting kind of like innovation that way as well. So like a lot of good things that happen. And also then dispelling the myth and also making it more common for men to talk about menstruation, which is a huge taboo in a lot of cultures.
Yes. And before we've talked about teaching men, teaching our boys, teaching them that it's okay to be carrying products for your friends. It's okay to be carrying products for your sister or your family members, and not to have the taboo around it. We all come because we're all having a period. People are having periods so that we can give birth. Like, it just drives me nuts. Like, let's talk about it. Let's normalize it. Let's give people the language, right? Like, it could change the world.
I'll never forget, I one time saw a tweet from a male politician whose name escapes me at this point, but it was talking about the need to make menstrual products tax-free, or possibly even maybe one day provide them for free in the US. And the tweet was like, I just don't understand, if you're menstruating, why can't you just hold your period until the next time you go to the bathroom? And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the level of education of people who are making these laws for us. Like, they don't know. And it's fine not to know things. I want to normalize, like, it's okay to ask questions about things that you don't know. Like, we're not going to cancel anybody, but it's just like, this education should have happened in school. There should have been sex ed that included this, and there just isn't. And I was like, oh, this is how it happens. This is why. And I think that might have been this tweet that was the one that my friend Stephen saw that connected Bethany. And I was like, well, Mary Beck just screams into the void about these things. She might as well find a partner to scream into the void with.
Full circle.
Yes.
Okay, so that the tweet that connected you two was prior to Dr. Period Hackers launching in August of 2021.
Yeah, but probably not by much.
Not by much.
I don't know. I scream about menstruation all the time and like other like feminist soapbox things. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly which one.
Okay. Great. And listeners, we will have their Twitter links, user handles in the show notes so you can follow along and hear the feminist soapbox rants that you need, the menstruation advocacy rants that you need to hear. But here's my question. That was 2021. We're now in 2022. What are you hoping for Dr. Period Hackers and the rest of this year, for the future? You mentioned maybe video. Where else can you bring this wonderful knowledge you're bringing to Twitter?
I think right now we're just kind of trying to expand our Twitter platform. That the association that we had with NHF we loved. We had so much fun with that. And so I think we kind of come from both sides of wanting to provide education for menstruators about their periods and their period experiences. But also one of my passions is to try to educate other doctors, because we don't learn this stuff in med school. Like we really should. Maybe somebody touches on it during an OB-GYN rotation, but like I had to go back and like teach myself and look up all these literature, like what is normal? Because it's just not ingrained, unless you're in OB-GYN. So, I think we want to keep expanding our education, both on the medical side of things and on kind of the more general population facing side of things. Maybe someday we'll be cool enough to do our own podcast or YouTube channel or something like that. But we're also working with some interns, hopefully on some research projects coming up to try to understand more how people learn about menstruation and how it affects different aspects of life. So right now we're kind of trying to grow our research area.
Okay. Yeah. We've talked about maybe like having some of our interns who are internet savvy, like develop pictures and stuff like that. We're also wanting to get like a website up, maybe get some branding done to kind of grow the brand. It all just sort of took off a lot quicker than we thought it would. And it's also really reaffirming to know that there is this audience of people out there who are also obsessed with talking about periods as well. So it's something that I've seen like a change as I teach like in public health, like in those spaces. The first couple of years, there were no students who were interested in talking about it. And now they're like, I want to talk about period poverty. And I'm like, yes, me too. Let's do this. And so it's like very slowly kind of growing. And I'm really excited to see the field of public health start talking about this. And then hopefully we can like spill over into other disciplines and just like the general population. Yeah, let's do it. Periods.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I mean, so much support here. We hope to have you back on Flow as more happens.
Yes.
For a second, can we talk about the research projects you have coming up? Is there any way listeners can get involved yet? Or are things really early stages? We'd love to know.
Things are really early stages, but one that we're primarily thinking about, we're hoping to get a survey of folks. And it's probably going to take us a few months to get that up and running. But when we do, we'll definitely post the link to participate on Dr. Period Hacker. So if you follow us there, that will be where you can find it.
Yeah, and we're looking at things like where people get their menstrual education, what collection methods they've had, other just like sociodemographic factors, and maybe building in a few things about like menstrual advertising and the current slang that people are using. Because the last study on menstrual slang was, I think it was a paper published in 1972. The author is definitely Natalie Jaffe, and that's sort of the last one. It's like the preeminent article on this. But yeah, like definitely like needs some updating, because we hear about menstruation all the time, like in music and TV and things like that. So just seeing what kind of slang we're using today.
That sounds wonderful. And it does kind of feel like menstrual awareness is this thing where people are popping up and going, you're saying like, I want to talk about that too. Yes, it does seem like if we think and talk about this, that things are getting better. If we align with what is happening with the feminine body, that things might be helpful in communication and in relationships if we first take on the awareness of what's going on with the menstruation.
Yeah. And the other thing to say is we're thinking it's going to be a survey on the internet. So it's definitely something that anyone, anywhere in the U.S. who's broadly, I think, speaking between 18 and 45 can take, as long as you've ever menstruated even just one time in your life. Then we want to hear from you. We want to hear from everybody and get like a diversity of these experiences. And then maybe from there, we'll do some maybe more qualitative research to talk about like medical invisibility of menstruation and things like that. What happens like in that doctor-patient office, you're having those conversations if it's something you talk about, and like what your experiences have been like talking about menstruation with your providers.
That would
They have
be
like a million
fascinating.
ideas. We
would
still
love
have
to
enough
hear
time.
about that. Yeah, that's amazing.
The problem is that we still have to teach. I still have to teach, and Bethany still has to see patients and teach, and all of the other things that she has to do.
Listen, we have time. We know how to count it. Our cycles help us count the time. So things will happen as they do. The Flow team looks forward to staying abreast of all that you're doing and to staying connected in the menstrual awareness community that we are all in.
Yes.
Yay.
Thank you guys so much for having us. What a great opportunity. It's been super fun.
Thanks.
I just love that I can talk about periods with other people who also want to talk about periods. It's incredible.
Yes.
Cheers to that.
Cheers for sure.
That was rockin'. We love bringing you amazing menstrual awareness resources. Catch us the second Thursday of every month with new episodes from Bloodstream Media.
Bloodstream Media is more than just a rare disease podcast network. With shows on chronic pain, menstrual health, and Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, Dungeons and Dragons. Bloodstream Media's got a little something for everyone. Visit bloodstreammedia.com or find Bloodstream Media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram to learn more.
Flow is produced by Bloodstream Media. Shout out to Amy Board, creative director, and your hosts, Sarah Watson and Jessica Richmond. In 2022, Flow will have new episodes the second Thursday of every month.
Hey, that's the day after I start menstruating.